Right. Welcome everyone back to day 7, the final class of our How to Read the Bible course. Our class today is titled Tools and Resources, and it's going to be a bit different than our previous days. On today's docket, we will in real time be demonstrating how to use some free online tools and resources that you can go away and use in your own study as you exegete for yourself. Secondly, we will share some recommendable secondary sources. And to round off the class, we will carry out some text studies together. So, we will be visiting some websites and demonstrating how to use them. I will do my best to switch between our PowerPoint and the website browser as smoothly as possible. Please bear with me. You know how it is when you've done something many times and you work on autopilot, but then as soon as you're observed, everything just kind of crumbles. So hopefully it will be okay. Now, you can proceed with these tutorials in a number of ways. There are a few options. You can either open up these sites on your computer, another device if you'd like, and follow along. Or you can take notes and duplicate the steps. Or you can simply watch, learn, and then revisit the video if you need any updates or reminders of how to do things. So you can proceed with these tutorials in the way that you choose. Again, we do upload the recordings of these to YouTube, so if you do want to revisit anything here, you'll be able to do that on our YouTube channel. And now, let's get right into it. The first resource we recommend most of you are likely already familiar with, the website called Bible Gateway. But just in case there's someone who doesn't know about it, this is a free website. It is the text of the entire Bible, and we'll just briefly show a few of its features which you can make use of in your own study. So we'll pop over there and have a little look. Okay. Now I've tried to make my cursor nice and big so you're able to follow along as I move around the page. This is the main home page that we land on Bible Gateway. You can either type in a specific verse or passage that you're looking for. So let's type in Luke 8. And we just press enter. And there we have Luke 8. So just press the Bible Gateway logo up here, and then we go back to the home page. If you go to the home page, you'll see that there's a drop-down menu of the books of the Bible over here, if you want to find a specific book. And then, for example, you could go directly to Ruth, click Ruth, it'll take you there. Next, over here on this menu, let's see if I can move you around here. You'll find a list of almost every English Bible version in circulation. So right now we're on the New International Version, the NIV. But if you drop down, you'll find various versions. Here are the English ones. You can also go for Spanish. And over here are also other languages. So we have everything from Arabic, Bulgarian, Spanish, Cherokee, Japanese, and so on. This is quite a useful feature because we now have basically a lot of the Bible versions you might want to use in one place. And you can also compare versions side by side. So we again type in Luke 8. And then we go over here where there's these two little sort of pages next to each other where it says add parallel, and we click on there. Now over here, we will have our New International Version. And if you'd like to compare it, for example, to the Complete Jewish Bible, then we find the Complete Jewish Bible, CJB, click on there, and now you can compare them. So after this Jesus, after this Yeshua. You can also add more parallels if you'd like, so just click on there again, and then it'll add a third and fourth, and I don't know if it goes into infinity, but you can certainly add a few on there. And if you want to close these parallels, you just click the little X in the top corner there. Another useful feature on BibleGateway.com is that you can change the font size. So pop up to the top right-hand corner here. If you benefit from having, for example, very large text, you can have it extra large. Something else that you can also do is use a highlighter. For example, if I wanted to highlight this paragraph, I would do like so. And as soon as you release, you get these various colors. So I'll pick pink and it'll highlight that for you. These highlighters do not remain there unless you are logged in, but you can log in a completely free with Bible Gateway. So that shouldn't be a problem. All they need is your email. And then you can go ahead and highlight to your heart's content. And if you're logged in, it will remember your choices. And it just sometimes makes it a little bit easier to go through the text and see what you're looking at. Now, if we go up here to the top, we have our little settings button, or it says page options. You can go ahead and click on there. And here we have a few options of what you'd like to show up in the text. So right now we've selected footnotes, verse numbers, and headings. You can, for example, get rid of the verse numbers, which would be interesting to read. Let's now add cross-references. Now already, right here, we see that we have a little cross-reference. If we click on there, it shows us that the same text, or the story is also being referenced in Matthew 4:23. So that can be very useful to have a look at and see whether or not, for example, another part of the Bible is being quoted by someone. The right kind of proof texting, as we were talking about yesterday. All right, similarly, you can include or exclude, we said the verse numbers. You can also include or exclude the headings, which is sometimes useful if you don't want other translators to tell you what this text is about, but you'd like to make up your own mind. And there you have it, a straightforward online resource to study with. There's other features on here, but those are some that you might find really useful. Okay. The second resource that we're going to suggest and recommend is a website called BibleHub.com. This is very similar in some ways to BibleGateway.com, but very sadly, it's the lesser known younger brother of BibleGateway.com. But it has some, I would say, a treasure trove of additional tools that we will now explore. So we'll pop over to Bible Hub. There we go. Here we have the home page. Now at the very top of the page where it says Gen, for Genesis, we have a drop-down menu again of the books of the Bible, pretty easy to find. And you can, of course, put in the specific chapter and verses over here. At the very top of this page as well, in the search bar, you can search for, again, a specific text or even a keyword. If you want to look up goats in the Bible, we can type in goat. And already there, it starts to show us some suggestions. We could press enter. And there it would bring us to all the references to goats in the Bible, if that's the sort of thing you need. Back to the home page, click on the logo. Let's again look up Luke 8. Type in Luke 8 and enter, and it brings us to Luke 8. Now we can pick from the various versions on this light blue menu up here. For now, we're just going to pick NIV, just to make it a bit simple. Here we have Luke 8 from the NIV. Now, depending on the chapter, you'll sometimes find on the left-hand column maps of the region being mentioned in this text. You can, for example, click here on the map, and we're going to click on where it says Galilee. And we're shown the etymology of the location name, references to this place in other Bible texts, and some general facts about the location. We're also shown occurrences of when this is mentioned other places in the Bible, and that can be quite helpful. Okay, let's go back to Luke 8. When you are looking at specific verses, if you see this menu bar here at the top of the page, you can use this tool up here called Parallel. Let's click on that. Luke 8:1. On the left-hand side, we have the major Bible versions of Luke 8:1 in English. You can make comparisons with them. And on the left-hand side, if you scroll down, on the right-hand side, if you scroll down, we also have down here where it says cross-references. You can see this same event, for example, being mentioned in the other Gospels, in Luke and so on. And further down the page, we have something called Treasury of Scripture. These have similar Bible texts that may reflect the same theme or the same keywords as you find in Luke 8:1. Again, can be quite useful. Scrolling back to the top of the page, coming back to this menu, there are a few features which I'd like to highlight. First, it says sermons, audio, and visuals. Now that may seem exciting, but I'm afraid it really isn't. I hope one thing we've firmly established in this class is that there are a lot of poor exegetes out there, and thus a lot of poor sermons too. So you can check these out, but I recommend ignoring these first sermons, audio, and visuals. So here it also says comment. It stands for commentaries. Again, a word of caution here. Not all commentaries are born equal. There are many lousy ones out there, and it is a bit of a mixed bag. So as responsible exegetors, we are not going to primarily depend on these commentaries. And this website doesn't sadly include some of the best ones, so it's best to skip past them, and it's not the recommendable feature in the main. But, and here is where Bible Hub absolutely shines. Next to the commentary feature, you can see where it says interlin, which stands for interlinear. Let's click on that. What you see here is Luke 8:1, and we're shown the original language alongside the English. So for now, ignore the little numbers at the top. Let's just look at the first word. It says kai. This is the phonetic version of the Greek word. It's anglicized. This is how it's pronounced. Kai. Beneath it, you can see the word kai is written in Koine Greek, right here, which we remember is the language the New Testament was written in. And then below it, we see the English translation, and. The little word beneath and is shortened as CONJ. If we hover over it with our cursor, okay, my cursor might be a little bit big and be blocking out the word, but it does say conjunction. Now that is a grammar term. You'll find each of the words in this verse have little grammar terms associated with them. It's just telling you what sort of word it is in grammatical terms. So if you go a couple of words over to your right, you, for example, get soon, which says that it's an adverb. You go over to he, and it says, well, it's a jumble of letters there, personal, possessive, pronoun. These terms are meaningless unless you're a big grammar buff and you understand grammatical terms. If you do, this feature can be helpful. And if not, that's okay. It's not strictly necessary for you to pay attention to it. Okay, so say you wish to explore a specific word in this sentence in the original language, you click on kai that is in blue. Let's click on that, which takes you to this page. Here you can see some other occurrences of Kai in the Bible, Matthew 1:2, Matthew 1:3, and so on. Then over here on the right side, where it says Strong's Greek at the very top, we can click on there. Strong's Concordance is what that stands for. Here we're giving a little info summary about this word. Kai, right over here. Kai meaning and, even, also. You get the phonetic version, or the transliteration, that's the same thing. And sometimes we're also told that it means and, even, also, and, namely at the bottom. If you scroll down, you'll find other lexicons as well, helps, NAS, and so on, and they may go deeper into detail. Kai is the most common New Testament conjunction, that it can mean and, also, very often, moreover, even, and indeed. So right here, that's what that tells us. Then we're told Kai is never adversative. It never means however or but, unlike the principal conjunction, which is wow in Old Testament Hebrew. All this informs us about how we are to translate the text, which can be helpful. But again, when you're using this function, it suffices often to just focus on the little left-hand corner box under Strong's Concordance, so basically this little area. And that will give you a lot of the information that you need. Now, let's go back to our interlinear view. Luke 8:1 begins with Kai, egeneto, ento, kathexes. Now we can see the translation choices that the translators of the NIV have been made regarding the word Kai. As we know, even in English, a word can have several meanings and several uses. We saw that Kai can mean and, also, very often, even, and indeed. And as with all translation work, you have to make a decision. And this decision, of course, ought to be heavily influenced, if not entirely determined, by the context. The context here seems to comfortably allow for Kai to be translated as and it came to pass. Now please note, if a passage or chapter begins with a word or phrase, such as but, therefore, and then, we must pay attention to this. Because when was the last time that you went up to your friend and began a conversation with the word, and then? Beginning like this suggests a continuation of something. When you're saying, what you're saying is something connected to something that's gone before. So we must ask ourselves, what comes before Luke 8:1? Well, Luke chapter 7, the end of Luke 7, beginning with verse 36. We can, for example, go there. Luke 7. Luke 7. There we go. Scrolling all the way down. All right. So from verse 36 right here and until the end, we find this story of a sinful woman approaching Jesus and anointing him with expensive oil. She does this in the house of a Pharisee named Simon, who is hosting a dinner for Jesus. Simon criticizes Jesus for allowing himself to be touched by a woman with a reputation of being a sinner. But Jesus shows her compassion, forgives her, and sends her on her way in peace and with dignity. So that's what comes before. Knowing this, how will that context shed light on what's about to happen in Luke 8? These are the questions we need to be asking. A tiny word like and but are important. Now, sometimes you will find in your exegeting that if you disagree with the translation choice, well, that's going to happen, and that's okay. Look into it. Make informed, contextually informed decisions on your translation choices. Let's look at another Greek word in Luke 8. So we go to Luke 8 and we go to interlinear. There we go. Over here towards the end of the first line, right here, we find the word pollen, translated as city. Let's click on the blue word pollen. We have our concordance as before. We click on Strong's Greek. And again, on the left-hand side, we have information about the word and its root. It tells us the root word of pollen is polis, meaning a city, or is also used to mean inhabitants of a city, where we get the word, in fact, in English, metropolis from. Scroll down, you find more information about the grammar and usage of the word. Back to Luke 8:1. Here at the top, you can see the blue back and forth arrows to go to the next or previous chapter, so that will help you navigate. Sometimes you may notice that the words appear in the original language seem all scrambled. For example, and it came to pass afterward soon that he was traveling through city and village, preaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 presumably were with him. Now, this is not the most scrambled version that you will find, but you will find some scrambled versions. And that is simply because Greek words in a sentence don't always appear in the same order as in English. Greek, in fact, can be hilariously jumbled. A little example of this, let's see, verse 2. And women certain who had been cured from spirits evil. So we wouldn't leave the words like this in our translation. We'd order them so that they make sense in English. We'd order them in, and certain women who had been cured from evil spirits. There are other tools on Bible Hub, but the interlinear tool is the main one that we recommend using. It can massively deepen and help you in your exegesis of any text. As much as it would be wonderful for everyone to, in a blink of an eye, learn Hebrew and Greek, the reality is that many don't have the time or the means to make that happen. By all means, if you'd like to study the languages, please do. But if that's not an option for you, using the interlinear tool in Bible Hub can help to bridge the gap between the original languages and yourself. It allows you to look closely at the meaning of words and also translation choices. We strongly urge you to use this tool when exegeting and not to take for granted that English translations that you have, as we've seen translators can be biased. So the interlinear tool in Bible Hub is a powerhouse of a tool. Deeply recommend that one. All right. A third tool which you can use, let me just quickly drag you all up here. Move your faces around. All right. Yes, a third tool which you can use if you're interested is a software program called Logos. Logos Bible Software. This is a program which functions very similarly to what we saw in Bible Hub, with interlinear text, grammatical breakdowns, commentaries, lexicons, and so on, except it goes into greater detail at times and is also available offline. But Logos is not free. So Bible Hub is an excellent free version if that's what you're looking for, with very similar features. On the other hand, if you are looking to invest money in a software, then Logos is the recommendable one. It is used at university level for theology students and Bible scholars. And it has, for example, it gives you a free electronic book every month, ranging from theology books to commentaries. And there are some other perks as well. So Logos is an option if you want to spend money on that sort of thing. Another free online resource you can use is called gntreader.com. This is a website with a very simple layout. It's very user-friendly. It is good if you want to deep dive into the grammar of the words in the text. Again, similar to what Bible Hub does, it's just formatted a little bit differently. So let's go and have a quick visit to GNT Reader. Here we go. Here we have it. So we're currently on Matthew over here. Let's go to Luke 8:1 again. We click on Luke, chapter 8, and there we have verse 1 at the top. And on GNT Reader, you'll notice something. We do not have the English text, only the Greek. So if you don't know Koine Greek, this can be good to use alongside Bible Hub, where you can see the English interlineary text. Verse 1, here is our first familiar word, Kai. If you go ahead and click on Kai, on the right-hand side, you'll see a column has shown up that shows an in-depth grammatical breakdown of this word. Go to the next word, egeneto. There we have it again. It says that this word is a verb. It is an aorist middle indicative third person singular form. That was a mouthful. This website is great, again, if you already know a bit about grammar and if you're learning Koine Greek as well, and you're trying to practice parsing, morphology, that sort of thing. If you're not familiar with these things, this website can be a little bit heavy and not really relevant for your use. And the point is, of course, to make exegeting accessible, so use what works for you. But it's still a useful tool worth mentioning, just not for everyone. Okay, let us close this window down and touch on a few Bible commentaries. If you're looking for a good Bible commentary series, we can recommend 3 really good choices. The first is called Hermeneia. This obnoxiously colored series we see here, printed by Augsburg Fortress Press. There are hundreds and thousands of Bible commentaries out there, and again, many of them fall short in quality. But in biblical studies, there are few series singled out more by scholars than this one. It is simply quite brilliant, and it is consistently giving a stellar contribution to the field. The introduction note reads, "The editors of Hermeneia impose no systematic theological perspective upon the series. It is expected that authors will struggle to lay bare the ancient meaning of a biblical work or pericope, meaning those who have worked on translation and the exposition in these haven't been forced into a narrow theological view by the editors, but have been allowed to go where the text may lead." That already makes me fall a little bit in love with this series. If you were to purchase the entire Hermeneia series in print, you'd pay nearly $4,000. But when you have Logos, you can purchase the electronic Logos edition and you'll save basically a lot of money compared with the print price. Plus, it takes up less space. Some of you may have this series in your local library, and if you do, I recommend using it. It's sadly not free to own yourself, but as said, if you want to go ahead and get Logos, the price is dramatically slashed. The second series recommended that we can mention is the Expositor's Bible Commentary. This is a pretty decent series. It has some fairly solid exposition throughout. Often, especially preachers enjoy this series because if you're not necessarily looking for the deepest academic content, this is quite user-friendly and approachable. And finally, my personal favorite, I have to say, is a very good commentary series. We have the Word Biblical Commentary. The Word series has some excellent overall work. It is judicious, insightful, and often well balanced in its analysis. A highly recommended series. A few things to keep in mind when you are consulting whatever commentary you're consulting. First, please do not assume that just because a commentary is older, that it's more accurate or true to the text. In fact, this is rarely the case. Secondly, at the beginning of the commentary, you will usually find an editor's note or an introduction section. And in this section, the editors will state their chosen methodology. They may use terms such as historical critical, for example. It can help to be aware of the methods that they have been using. For example, our translation is built on the foundation of the King James Version, which means it will then adopt many of the errors or biases that we find in the KJV. So check out the editor's note. That can be a very good indication. If you want a little overview of some of the other better commentary series out there, you can check out a website, an article called 7 of the Best Exegetical Bible Commentaries, a free article by Logos. It will be in your reading list as well. But please, as you move forward, as we always say, please prioritize the primary source before you go to your secondary sources. Now, let's talk a bit about languages. If you do decide you'd like to learn a biblical language, the biblical languages, here are some tools which you'll need. If you're learning Koine Greek, we recommend this textbook, The Elements of New Testament Greek by Jeremy Duff. This is an excellent textbook which takes you from the very basics, knowing nothing, through the alphabet, the vocabulary, and into basic grammar. Easy to follow, straightforward, and a best-selling book from Cambridge. This was the textbook that I used myself at university when learning Greek. There are also other books and resources as part of Duff's Greek series, for example, vocabulary cards and listening materials. But again, this book is the one that you'll really need. The second book you'll need is called Novum Testamentum Graece, which looks like this, otherwise known as the Nestle Aland edition. This book is the Koine Greek text of the New Testament. It's like your Greek New Testament Bible, basically. It's an edition called the Critical Edition, which means that it has drawn from various ancient manuscripts and determined which is closest to the original. So as you're studying the language, you'll learn the language from the textbook by Duff, and then begin reading and studying the Novum Testamentum Graece. These are the books that, again, first-year university students use. And they're also pretty cheap to purchase. Now, if you're learning Greek at home, you're doing it by yourself, and you're a person who feels they benefit from, in addition to going through the textbook, having some form of lecture or teacher just to nudge you along the way, there is a link to a free, there's a link in your resources list to this free resource. It goes to a playlist on YouTube where a Koine Greek teacher on YouTube has done a great job at going through Duff's textbook. He doesn't teach you Greek or cover everything in the book, but he goes through and highlights some things. And if you benefit from having a human touch and some sort of anchor, that may really, really help you. And lastly, a big part of learning a language is learning vocab. It's what you'll spend a lot of your time doing. And some find it very useful to have flashcards. There are some different card sets out there that you can pick from. For example, this Basics of Biblical Greek Vocabulary cards by William D. Mounts. That's a pretty good set. There are also some phone apps out there, for example, Greek for All Vocabulary app, linked in the resources list. This is a really cheap app. If you fancy having it on your phone, then you can take it around with you and learn vocabulary as you're going through your day. Before I move into Hebrew resources, this may seem a bit obvious to say at this point, but just so it's said, please be aware that there are different types of Greek and Hebrew, just like Old English and Modern English. So if you're going to learn Biblical Greek, it has to be what is called Koine Greek. And if you're learning Hebrew, it has to be Biblical Ancient Hebrew. Trying to learn Hebrew on Duolingo, for example, will not work for your purposes here, as they teach you Modern Hebrew. So here's your basics if you want to learn Koine Greek. Now, in the case of Hebrew, we recommend The Basics of Biblical Hebrew by Gary Pradico and Miles Van Pelt. This is actually a series, and in this series you get a book on grammar, a 36-part video lecture, a workbook, a set of vocabulary flashcards, 100 of them, vocabulary audio, so teaching you pronunciation, and a laminated sheet containing a shortcut to basics that you'll need to learn. This is an excellent pack, great if you're learning the language on your own. And again, first-year university students use it. It's all clear and high quality. Again, a link will be in your resources list to this stuff. If you do want to save money, there are plenty of students online who sell this series secondhand, for example, on eBay. So that's if after this course you'd like to learn Greek and Hebrew. Now, this option of learning biblical languages isn't for everyone. It isn't feasible or affordable or possible. And I would like to stress that that is more than okay. You don't have to learn Greek and Hebrew to begin exegeting. After all, the point of this course is to make it more accessible. All this to say, it's up to you. But again, please do use Bible Hub and its interlineary tool. Let's move on to another resource. This is specifically for those who are university students. If you attend a university, particularly in the UK, you may have access to an EBSCO account. If you have such an account, this means that you'll be able to sign in and access the ebooks and e-journals at the Roy Graham Library. The Roy Graham Library is the on-campus library of Newbow College in England. They have a decent collection of excellent theological books and journals. You can read these online, as we said, if you have the right account. And of course, you can visit the library in person. It's well worth exploring, particularly the upstairs north wing, so to your right. And last but not least, we have two final resources we can recommend, two books. The first is called Drama of Scripture by Bartholomew and Goheen. This is a book we've referenced before here at Sateo, both in this course and in our Covenant Theology course. The Drama of Scripture is an engaging way of being introduced to the methodology of biblical theology. It looks at the Bible as one big, unified story, and it returns the reader to view the text as a story that they are a part of. Great book, easy to read, even for beginners. The second book we can mention here is called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee. This book covers a lot of what we've done in this class, but goes into further detail on topics like literary analysis. So if you want to follow up and have more depth to what we've been looking at, this is another great book. And that's it for the resources that we'll mention today. There are obviously some other great books out there that we can mention. We do again state in the strongest terms, Not all books about the Bible are helpful or qualified in their guidance. We have a tendency also to seek out voices that mirror our own comfort zone, what is familiar to us and what we already know. But if what is familiar to us is irresponsible, albeit common theological malpractice, then we don't grow or move towards a better place. So be aware of method, be aware of personal and cultural bias, and context is always king. For the remainder of our class, we are going to be having some fun and carry out a few text studies. We will do this to practice, practice, practice using the exegetical tools we've learned and to demonstrate how powerful sound exegesis can be. Following our text study, we will round off with a few concluding remarks to close our course. But for now, let's have a 5-minute break. Okay, welcome everyone. We dive into our text studies. First, we go to Genesis chapter 38. This story does contain a trigger warning. We mention prostitution and spousal death. So if you'd like to skip this part, as always, you can mute this meeting and I will hold up my hand clearly for a few moments to the camera when we're done and you can rejoin us. Okay, Genesis 38, we begin reading from verses 1 to 11. So it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was a Chezib when she bore him. She was in Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he, too, would die, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Our story here begins with Judah, who is one of the sons of Jacob. Judah marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons with her, Onan, and Shelah. Judah's sons grow up. Judah picks a wife for his firstborn son, Her name is Tamar, but dies. And so Judah instructs his other son, the second in line, Onan, to perform the duty of a brother-in-law. It is both apparent from the text and from the historical context that this means having sexual intercourse with Tamar, so that she may bear a son. However, Onan is described as spilling his semen on the ground instead, meaning he doesn't ejaculate inside Tamar, but uses what he might today call the pull-out method. And we're told that he displeases God. A lot to unpack here. And at every level, we as Western readers are perhaps left with a sense of the absurdity, even the perversion of how this all plays out. Asking a brother-in-law to inseminate his widowed sister-in-law? What on earth? Now, the story of Onan and his actions have left a rather distinct mark on many, and some, I would say, Christian writing, both tradition and even language today. First of all, for centuries, many priests would instruct male members of their churches with the phrase, "It is better to cast your seed in the belly of a whore than to spill it on the ground." This stemmed from a belief that the meaning of the story of Onan was that male semen is so precious that adultery or soliciting prostitutes was a lesser sin than spilling one's seed, so to speak, the lesser of 2 evils. For a long time, Western society believed that the entire key to conception and life lay with the male, especially in his semen, and that women were simply a vessel in which a child was carried. Therefore, men's semen was equated with life. And this is not some ancient bygone idea either. We still find remnants of this thinking in the teachings of the Catholic Church, in which semen is viewed as sacred and masturbation and the use of contraception is considered a sin and is forbidden. Let us highlight two disasters among many that have sprung from this teaching. First of all, this verse has historically been used to justify fornication and adultery. Men have, with the support of their clergy, visited town prostitutes or had sex outside their marriage, all seemingly backed by the Bible. Secondly, the Catholic teaching against the use of contraception, including the use of condoms, has led to a number of crises and human suffering. As a continuation of a long tradition, in July 1968, Pope Paul VI issued an official letter called Humanae Vitae, meaning of human life. In it, he restated the Church's staunch opposition to contraception. One of the impacts of such teaching has been the unstemmed spread of the HIV virus and the AIDS epidemic. It has been found that countries struggling with high HIV rates will often have a high or predominant Catholic population. For example, in Kenya, it is Christian men and women who have the higher infection rate in comparison with their Muslim counterparts. Despite how AIDS has ravaged whole countries, the Catholic Church continues to hold fast to their teaching of no contraceptives and instructs parents to avoid letting their children be taught safe sex methods, that abstinence is the only option aside from marital sex. This leads to a lack of sexual and health education and the continued spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, which cause everything from infertility to cancer to death. Another impact which this teaching has had concerns financially unsustainability in Catholic families stricken by poverty. Many Catholic married couples, due to a lack of contraceptive options, often end up with many children. This is a problem if you cannot financially support or feed those children. In the city of Manila, many of the Filipino maternity wards are so full that new mothers have to share one bed with 2 other patients. But in the deeply Catholic Philippines, church leaders still hold sway over politics. A former Filipino senator, Manny Pacquiao, stated God said, "Go forth and multiply." He did not say, "Go and have just 1 or 2 children." A previous president of the Philippines has been threatened with excommunication from the Catholic Church for his support of a bill which would make contraceptives more available. And all the while, the uncontrollable population growth leads to food shortage, starvation, and a compromised ecosystem. A similar thing happened in Ireland, particularly during periods of famine or food shortage, where poorer Catholic families would experience inescapable generational poverty and even starvation, being unable to feed or sustain a large family. And yet they could not, according to the Catholic Church, use contraceptives. Beyond this, the health and welfare of working class women, those who are least likely to have access to contraceptives, often suffered greatly as a result of multiple births. And this isn't even beginning to mention issues such as the lack of respect for the autonomy of women's bodies, the high death rate of mothers with pre-existing health conditions, and high-risk pregnancies or the removal of choice. Once again, we see the interpretation of biblical text having massive real-life repercussions. A common interpretation of the story of Onan is that God struck him down because he wasted, so-called, his seed. But let us have a second look at Genesis 38. In the previous chapter, we have the story of Judah and his brothers selling off their brother Joseph into slavery to Egypt. And while Joseph is in Egypt, it's as though the story goes, in the meantime, this is how life was back home. The years roll on, Judah has 3 sons, his eldest died, and this whole situation happens. In order to understand this story, we must understand the cultural and historical realities and customs of the time. First of all, fertility and the bearing of children was seen as a woman's rite of passage in society, to having a place, status, respectability, and also financial and future stability. A woman's survival in this society depended on her connection and ties to men, whether it was her father, her husband, or her son. A woman would basically move from being provided for under her father's roof and then later her husband's. This was the only honorable way for a woman to have a roof over her head, food, and protection. We must stress in the strongest terms here that this is not God implemented or God willed, but it is how the current culture worked. And this is why there existed this custom where if a wife or one man became a widow, it was considered the obligation, the responsibility of one of the dead man's brothers to then impregnate her and give her an heir. This would give the widow access to the inheritance that would have been given to her dead husband. She couldn't, as a woman, have access to that inheritance on her own. She would basically have to mother a son and then gain access to it through him. Secondly, we must also keep in mind that the greatest amount of inheritance went to the eldest son of the family. The second largest went to the second son, and so on down the line. Now, with this in mind, we understand better what is happening here. Judah tells his second eldest son, Onan, to carry out his duty and to give Tamar a son. But Onan instead spills his semen onto the ground. Why? Well, verse 9 tells us the reason. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled the semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. Onan's choice has to do with inheritance. If Tamar, his older brother's widow, bears a son, then she gains access to the largest portion of the inheritance. But if Tamar does not bear a son, then Onan becomes the next in line. He receives the lion's share. Onan doesn't want to lose that to an offspring that would be viewed in their society as the son of heir, even though the child would biologically be Onan's. So if we begin to see now, Onan through his actions is stealing Tamar's future survival. He is deliberately depriving a widow of her access to life support and living. He's keeping her from being protected or a respected person in society because Onan wants the lion's share of his father's inheritance. Now, this theme in the story is further highlighted if we see how it continues. Let's keep reading. Verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Judah promises his daughter-in-law that she may bear a son by Judah's third and youngest son when he grows up. He says, "Stay in your father's house, Tamar, until Shelah can perform this duty, and then you will have access to the inheritance that your inheritance rights are due." But we're told he does this because he fears Shelah would die too. Judah basically seems to be hoping that nothing comes of this, that Shelah does not have to give Tamar a son. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," She put off her widow's garment, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. Judah is passing through the area where Tamar lives. She hears that he's coming, and what does she do? She takes off her widow's garment, the clothes of mourning, and dresses up specifically with a veil. Why does she do this? Well, the author is telling us of her expectations. She thinks that Judah is bringing Shelah so that she can finally marry him. She wears a veil because this is the custom back then of a new bride and how she would be introduced to her husband on the wedding day before consummating the marriage. And so her taking off her widow's clothes basically tells us what she thinks is about to happen, only she sees that Shelah is grown up and hasn't been given to her in marriage yet. Verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Upon arriving, Judah sees Tamar and mistakes her for a prostitute. Imagine that. She's standing there heartbroken and in shock, and now she's mistaken for a prostitute. Not only that, but her father-in-law doesn't recognize her and says he wishes to solicit her immediately, promising that he will later pay her with one of the lambs of his flock. Now, Tamar had already had some experience with Judah not doing things that he's promised to do. And so she says, "You need to make a down payment, a pledge." And she asks for some items, and he agrees and gives them to her. Verse 20. When Judah sent the kid by his friends the Adullamite to cover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said no prostitute has been here." Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." Judah tries to get back his belongings to pay Tamar, and he is embarrassed. Interesting. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of prostitution." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. So Judah solicits what he thinks is a prostitute, and then he receives word that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant through prostitution. What does he say? Bring her out and let her be burned. The utter audacity, the double standards here is astounding. And this goes beyond hypocrisy or pointing the finger. The very fate of a widowed woman who were not appropriately cared for was often a life of prostitution. As is the reality today, prostitution is not the dream or the first choice of any woman. It comes from a societal rejection, poverty, desperation, force. It's a last resort and final choice for those who have no other choice, suffering the disgrace and exploitation of a male-dominated society. This passage in Genesis 38 is not about masturbation. This passage is not about contraception, nor is it about how semen is magically sacred, nor is it a lesson about contraceptive measures. It's a story about the criminal neglect of a vulnerable widow. If you read the rest of the Old Testament, you will find God speaking extensively about the cause of widows and orphans in society. Widows and orphans. These are the vulnerable in society, those trapped in poverty, seen as less, without protection, rights, power, or belongings. The pulse of the spiritual state of God's people was measured by how they treated widows and orphans, the poor and the marginalized. The story of Tamar is the story of the widow. In fact, it's the first mention in the Bible of the word widow. She is a widow who has failed by the choices of Onan and of Judah, by two men who refused to take responsibility or care for this woman's survival through honorable means. Onan, in essence, treated her as a prostitute. He had sex with her under false pretenses. Judah literally treated her as a prostitute and called for her to be punished as one. And who do you think outed Tamar's pregnancy and called her a prostitute to begin with? It would be her father or someone in her father's house. Either way, the fate of Tamar when her father eventually died would be to receive no support or inheritance because she was a woman, meaning she would likely have to be a prostitute in order to survive anyway. Genesis 38 condemns the men who exploit vulnerable women, who see themselves as blameless as they exploit them, submitting women to patriarchal societal roles, while all the while pointing the accusing finger, ignoring the direct pipeline that runs from being neglected and being a vulnerable woman to becoming a prostitute, who is then blamed and shamed in life for her situation, condemned for being so-called corrupt, lustful, or lewd. And yet the only person who is blameless and a vulnerable victim in this entire narrative is Tamar. But she is the only one condemned by the people around her. Now, we might read this story and focus our discomfort on how God seems harsh in his punishment of Onan. But that is until we begin to understand the deep evil that Onan and these men carried out. He was willing to weave a situation where a woman would have to make the choice between being raped or starving to death for the rest of her life. No, instead, this story should highlight to us in bright colors how deeply God condemns the sexual and financial exploitation of vulnerable women, and how seriously he took their protection, even within the imperfect patriarchal confines of that culture. And yet, even though that is what the story is about, Christian tradition and history has twisted it into being something else. If you go to Google now and you search for the word onanie, you'll get a Wikipedia hit that says, from German, onanie, masturbation, from the biblical figure Onan. In Norwegian and other Germanic languages, onanie is the word or synonym for masturbation, all having their root in this Bible character called Onan. And so a story about how seriously God takes the exploitation of women in society becomes redirected to instead be about everything from masturbation to contraception to sacred semen, all the while entirely missing the point. Exegesis is no small matter. And please, just so I'm not spreading misinformation here, the pull-out method does not work and is not an effective form of birth control, whatever your pastor or clergy may claim. Okay, let's go on to our second study. This will be a shorter one, but still a good demonstration. 1 Samuel 16, from verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, See now, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will feel better. So Saul said to his servants, Provide for me someone who can play well, and bring him to me. One of the young men answered, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me your son David, who is with the sheep. Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a kid, and sent them by his son David to Saul. And David said to Saul, and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. And Saul would be relieved and feel better, and the evil spirit would depart from him. So here we have another one of those texts in the Bible that can leave us scratching our heads. There's mention here of an evil spirit from the Lord which is tormenting King Saul. This is mentioned in verse 14. This is how the king's ailment is described by his servants in verse 15, repeated in 16, and again twice in verse 23. Now David, who was anointed to be the next king after Saul, he's done so in just the verses before verse 14. And he is brought in to soothe Saul by playing music. It seems to have a good effect, and Saul asks David to stay on. Later in chapter 18, while David is playing and singing for Saul, we are told again, the next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house, while David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. And again, in chapter 19, then an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, while David was playing music. He does like to hold that spear, doesn't he? Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. David fled and escaped that night. Here we have a repeated description of an evil spirit from the Lord tormenting Saul. How can it be possible, we ask, that an evil spirit, which is tormenting a human being, can come from God or be sent from God? Is not God good? Does he torment people? Is it his will to cause suffering? How can an evil spirit who's an enemy of the Lord come from the Lord? To understand this, we must remind ourselves of something we learned on day 4, specifically the concept of divine responsibility. Let us refresh our memories. In the modern West, we think of things in degrees of responsibility. more responsible or less? And we often come at the Bible stories ask, is God responsible for that or is he not? Now, this is where we have to try to enter a different world, because unlike us, the Hebrews thought of God's involvement in the world along these lines. Is there only one God? Yes. Since there is only one God and he is Lord of all, then ultimate responsibility, ultimate rests with him. Even if something is not his will or he doesn't do it directly, we talk about the final responsibility resting with him because there's only one God. Now, we try to nuance this in our culture, but that did not exist in those days. Here we have an example of the Hebrew mindset. James wrote that God doesn't tempt anyone. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And he goes on to write from verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Let's see here. David wrote in the Psalms, you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you. The rest of the biblical narrative negates the idea that evil can come from God or that it is his will or doing. We must look at the greater context to understand. The evil spirit did not come to Saul from God as in God sent it, nor was it God's will to tempt Saul, but the language here demonstrates a good example of Hebrew divine responsibility mindset. Next, we go to Romans 8. This is a good demonstration of how looking at the original language can really change things. Verse 28 is a verse commonly quoted, much used, deeply familiar to those, and perhaps read in the Bible as you've been growing up, and it is quoted as saying, all things work together for good to them that love God, or all things work together for those who love God, depending on your version. This is a text many cling to when things go wrong. A kind of spiritual version of every cloud has a silver lining. Sometimes fellow Christians remind each other of this verse as a way of offering consolation that things will work out in the end. Except this isn't what Paul wrote. We quoted the King James Version earlier, and the KJV translation made it sound as though everything, all events in the world have a kind of inner dynamic which would guarantee a happy outcome. But let's close this and use one of our tools and pop over to Bible Hub, because we're going to look at the original language. So let's go to Bible Hub. We go to Romans 8:28. And then we go to the interlinear text. Where it says, we know now that to those loving God, all things work together. This Greek word for works together, synerge, right here. Let's have a closer look at that. We click on it. We go to the Strong's Greek. It tells us that it's from the root word synergeo, to work together, cooperate with, work together. Okay. The verb Paul used doesn't mean works together for, as it's translated. It means work with. So, first of all, Paul is saying that it's God who works all things together for good, not that all things are doing it under their own control or are just naturally inclined to be good or work out. This immediately disqualifies an outlook on life that is merely optimistic. Paul is not talking about optimism. He's not saying the universe makes things work themselves out. It doesn't. And secondly, by looking at this verb synerge, where we get the English word synergy from, Paul is explaining how God does this. How does he work all things together for good? He does it in collaboration with certain people, alongside people, those who love God. A topic of Romans chapter 8 has to do with vocation. God inviting people, all people, to share in what he's already doing. Now, in Romans 8, we get a fuller context of Paul's idea, and he explains how this works in practice. God knows that the present creation is groaning together. Like a woman going into labor, these labor pains are the birth pangs of God's new creation. And people who have been grasped by the gospel story, people who are led by his Spirit, are called to share in that groaning in prayers of lament. When that Spirit-led lament is happening, as Paul explains in 26 and 27, God himself, who understands and sees our hearts, will hear that groaning from the dark places of creation's pain. And those who pray that way, even when, precisely when, they don't even know what to pray for, will thereby be formed, shaped into the shadow, this reflection of Jesus. Jesus who submitting to a cross, Jesus who shared the pain of the world so that the world will be healed and helped. Paul says that exactly in verse 29, and they will thereby be cooperating, not in the work of their own salvation, but in the larger purpose of God, bleeding with his creation. Romans 8:28 is not about how following Jesus means that you should turn that frown upside down, that there's a silver lining to darkness and pain. Nor is it saying that everything in life will resolve itself in this age. It is instead an assurance that if you look at the pain of the world and lament arises inside of you, even when you can't put words to it, it means the Spirit is already working in your heart. It means that you are feeling something that is right and true and in line with God's loving and healing. So it's not a call to deny lament, instead to embrace it. And so a better version, or translation rather, of Romans 8:28 would be, we know, in fact, that God works all things together for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Looking at the Greek and translating a single word in this case shifted the meaning of this verse. Next, we turn to 1 Corinthians 7:5. Here we have a trigger warning for mention of marital rape. Once again, you can mute this meeting if you'd like. I'll hold up my hand at the end. Okay, 1 Corinthians 7:5a. It begins, do not deny one another. Some translations say, do not deprive one another. The rest of the verse continues, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now here we have instructions written by Paul in his letter to the Corinthian church, and in particular he's addressing married couples. He's talking about sex, having sex within the marriage. This verse has historically been plucked out and pasted into many an argument about how sexual intercourse is owed between marital partners. Men particularly have argued, with the backing of their clergy, that wives owe sex to their husbands as a marital duty, stating, "See, even Paul says so. Do not deny one another, do not deprive one another. So, wife, do not deny me sex. I am owed it according to God's will." This line of thinking has led to everything from husbands who have in overt and covert ways felt justified in pressuring, nagging, or manipulating their wives to have sex, to justifying infidelity or the consumption of pornography. "I'm a man. I have needs. I didn't get it from you, so I went elsewhere to fulfill those needs." To being a justification for marital rape. "I have a right to your body. We are one. I was just taking what I was owed." Now, everything about this interpretation is anti-consent. It feeds into rape culture and is therefore anti-free will. And that couldn't be further from the will of God. It also depicts sex as it being a human right or a need, and this verse is used as a biblical evidence for that spouses should not deny each other. So let's have a closer look at the real meaning of this text. For that, we turn to the context in which this letter was written. As we said, Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church of believers. This community was located 80 kilometers northwest of Athens in Greece. Corinth, we can see here on the map, was a coastal city, and naturally this Greek metropolis was heavily steeped in history and culture of the Hellenistic philosophy. That was the cultural context of this region. One branch of Greek philosophy which was particularly prevalent in these times and in Corinth was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism taught that reality exists in two planes. One is the lower material world, the world of matter, and above is the world of thoughts, ideas, concepts, the immaterial spiritual world. The lower world was taught to be corrupt, base, sinful, and it is our purpose to escape into the higher world of thought, the matterless, bodiless, spiritual experience. What were some of the implications of this? Well, it meant that things of matter had to be inherently bad and ought not to be considered or valued, and this included the human body and the functions of the human body. What had happened in Corinth was that some of the new believers had combined the teaching of Gnosticism with their Christian faith. They believed in Jesus, but practiced Gnosticism as well. They taught other Christians that denying their body's needs or distancing oneself from everything in the material world was the path to greater enlightenment and a higher truth and spirituality. And so many of these Christian converts were deciding that this means sex is bad. Sex is inherently evil and base and corrupt. Married couples were no longer having sex because everything to do with the body was bad. They thought that abstaining from sex made them more holy, pure, and enlightened. This is what Paul is responding to. He's not talking about abolishing consent. He's not talking about that sex is a human right, or that one owes sex to one's marital partner. He is specifically speaking to the Gnostic practitioners in this faith community, saying, do not deny each other in your marriages. Do not withhold sex, thinking this is your path to purity or salvation. It is not. He goes on to say in verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. So Paul is not saying everyone must be having sex, nor is he, as some believers have, elevated sex to the other extreme as being some sort of path to experiencing God in a closer way. There is here a clear picture of the choice is up to you. You can remain unmarried. You can remain celibate like me, But God is a God who created the material world. In Genesis 1, he made a material world, made our bodies, created sex. And at the end of it, he declares that it is all very good. Gnosticism would go on to be a major problem and a heretical movement of the 2nd century Christian church. And here we have just one local example of where this unbiblical, anti-material teaching had manifested. Paul is saying this is not the way to salvation. Here we have a verse which was added to the oppression of women and sexual violence, but which was in fact meant to honor sex and the union of bodies in a safe, committed environment built on mutual trust and absolute respect. The last and final text study we'll be looking at together is found in Luke 21, verses 1 to 4. And after this, we will conclude our course. Luke 21. He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." Many of us have probably heard this story of the widow and her coins. Each time I've heard it preached, you can decide for yourself, but I've heard the application has always been the same. This woman gave all she had to God, and so we should give all we have to God. It has been proof texted with other verses like, "Give and it shall come back to you." This idea of give everything you have to God and you shall be blessed. Or God wants everything from you, surrender all. There was a woman in Texas who went to see her grandparents, to see how they were doing. And when she arrived, she noticed that the power in their house was turned off. They had no electricity, and she also saw they had very little food. This puzzled her because she had always known them to be careful to budget and they were living off a good pension. Something didn't add up here. So she asked her grandparents what happened, and they replied, "Our church told us that we all need to increase our giving." The woman felt shocked by this. "So you've given them so much you can't pay for food and electricity?" "Yes," said her grandparents. "Our pastor said that giving everything we have to God makes us just like the widow who was praised by Jesus in the temple for giving her 2 last coins." Now, I was taught that God wants all of us to give something we have and everything we have, just like the widow in Luke 21. I have personally seen friends lack daily needs like food, money for rent, hygiene products, because they believed that too and gave everything to God or to their church. There's more than one elderly couple out there without electricity because their pastor said so too. Surrender all. Give all you own. But how does this reality coincide with the Jesus who came to help the poor, who defended the marginalized? How can a God who loves and defends the poor be asking for something that results in more poverty, in more marginalization, in more need and struggle? Well, let's return to the text and apply our golden rule: context. I feel like there should be a choir every time we say the word context in the background, just like, oh, yeah, context. The scene of Luke 21 is set in the Jerusalem temple. It begins with describing Jesus watching people putting gifts into the temple treasury, a bit like the offering basket of the temple. Verse 1 says, "He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. And then he also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all she had to live on. But what comes directly before this verse? What is the contextual context of the beginning of Luke 21? If you have your Bibles open or you're looking at it online, please turn one page back to the end of Luke 20, the previous chapter. Luke 20 ends on this, from verse 45. In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and who love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And right after this, he looked up and saw the rich people putting their gifts in the treasury and sees the poor widow. The rich were putting in money after their wealth, the widow out of poverty. The typical interpretation is that we should be like the widow, not like the rich people. The rich people just give a little, they make it a show. She doesn't do it for a show, she does it with dignity. But there's a bit of a problem with this interpretation. It is nowhere in the text at all. It doesn't say the widow gave all she had, you should go and do so as well. That's one of Jesus' favorite phrases, in fact. He seems to say a lot of go therefore and do likewise, and he doesn't say that here. Jesus doesn't bring attention to the widow for the sake of pointing out an example for his disciples to follow. Jesus describes the widow's gift without commentary and then abruptly starts talking about something else in verse 5. So why does Jesus mention it at all? Because as the context reveals, Luke 21, 1-4 isn't the beginning of the section. They're the end of a section. The beginning of the section is what we read earlier, end of Luke 20. Luke 21 is the continuation. So let's read it again like one block, the way that it's meant to be read. In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and who love respectful greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Then, as Jesus looked up, he saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all she had to live on." Jesus warned the people around him about the corrupt religious leaders who care more about their power and wealth than the lives of marginalized people around him. This lesson is a criticism against any religious systems of thought or monetary giving which manipulates vulnerable members into giving. Any greedy system that masks a message of generosity and surrendering all to God and exploits them. The scribes, those who are experts at scripture, who are described as devouring widows' houses. Jesus is condemning this exploitation, and he says those who prop up these practices will be punished severely. Quite a different message coming out of Luke 21 when we read it in the proper context. That was our last class and our last text study together. But I hope it won't be the last text study or exegesis that you go and do yourself. Before we part ways, I'd like to leave us with 3 last thoughts, 3 points to address. Accessibility, responsibility, continuity. And they all rhyme, so you know it's going to be good. Charles Spurgeon was an English pastor and preacher in the 1800s. He was passionate about the poor of Victorian London. He built an almshouse, an orphanage there, and encouraged his congregation to actively engage with the marginalized. He has a famous quote which goes, "Defend the Bible, I would as soon defend a lion. Unchain it, and it will defend itself." Now, this quote has often been co-opted by people who defend using scripture to attack others and apply spiritual abuse in the name of, "I'm just speaking the truth." But let us consider this idea as it was meant to be understood, in the light of accessibility. Even in a time when information is perhaps never been more readily available to us, Bible illiteracy is a widespread and disastrous reality. The Bible is quoted left, right, and center, online, by politicians, on bumper stickers. But Bible literacy, as not only history has taught us, but religious leaders of Jesus' day taught us, is not knowing the words by heart. Bible literacy is also rooted in methodology, in having the right tools to understand what it is that you're reading. You can have all the ingredients for a cake on the kitchen counter, but if you don't know how to separate the ingredients or how they work together, you're going to end up with something that makes your guests sick. The right recipe, the right tools are needed. At the beginning of our course in our introduction, we talked about this gap that exists between scholars and lay people. Because the academic arrogance and disconnectedness of one, and just open the Bible and do as it says on the other hand, neither extreme is what we need. Informed Bible reading needs tools to be freely available to anyone. You shouldn't have to pay years for a university course to have access to this stuff. If you have doubt about that the Bible was meant to be read easily and accessibly, consider for a moment what language the New Testament was written in. Koine Greek, common Greek. Koine Greek was street language. It was slang. It was slang version of classical Greek used for trading, a simplified shared language of the region. Even the language in which the story of Jesus is told emphasizes approachability and contextualizing, making it approachable for everyday people. This is a strong argument against academic elitism. The Bible can be chained up in more than one way, and we have to find a way around making sure that that doesn't happen. That is the point of this course, and that is the reason why Ziteo School does what it does. And I hope that this is a purpose and passion which moves us, creates a fire in us to liberate both ourselves and others, to empower us with tools and inspire us to move forward and learn. The point of this class is not for you to have yet another authoritarian voice telling you this is what the Bible is saying. Nor is it for you to go away with a sense of superiority or lord it over other people, but for you yourself to be empowered. And to use the tools that the Bible gives you, tools that were determined by the Bible itself and practiced by Jesus, David, Paul, Isaiah. The second concluding thought I'd like to leave us with concerns responsibility. There's a 2010 movie called The Book of Eli. Denzel Washington plays Eli, the main character who's traveling through a barren, post-nuclear, war-torn Northern America. With him, he carries a book. His goal is to deliver his copy of this mysterious book to a safe location on the West Coast to be protected and preserved there. However, as he travels, he passes through a town which is run by a tyrannical warlord called Carnegie. And what Carnegie cares most about is power, controlling people and maintaining power. While Eli is in town, Carnegie discovers that the book which Eli carries is a Bible. And most books, including Bibles, were all destroyed during the war. Now, Carnegie isn't a believer. He isn't a religious man, but he says he must have that book, saying, I grew up with that book. I know its power. Carnegie is one of the few people in town who knows how to read, and this is one of the reasons he wants it. Now, he sees unlimited potential if he possesses this Bible. Before the war, he experienced how this book could sway masses, what great influence it could have. And he says that people will do anything, say anything, if you get them on board with saying that this is what the Bible says. One of his henchmen asks Carnegie why he's willing to go through so much fuss to get his hands on this book. And Carnegie responds, I'll leave out the expletives. It's not a book, it's a weapon. A weapon aimed right at the hearts and minds of the weak and desperate. It will give us control of them. If we want to rule more than just one small town, we have to have it. People will come from all over. They'll do exactly what I tell them if the words are from the book. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. All we need is that book. Now, I don't recommend this movie necessarily. It is heavily violent for one. But the story does a great job at demonstrating something which is happening throughout history on a loop. The Bible is seen by different people in different ways. To some, a tool to control others or to those who seek power. For others, it's a liberating tool. For those genuinely seeking truth, justice, and freedom. But as with all tools, we have to know how to wield it. Using this text irresponsibly, whether deliberately or not, has upheld a long list of pretty awful things. Even today, as we go through this class, I watch as people I know, people I've known maybe for most of my life, people who have grown up in church, who have read the Bible all their lives, justify and rationalize a genocide, the genocide of the Palestinian people, which is happening right now by using this book. As we approach the Bible, we must be aware and take ownership of how we use it. Almost like taking a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. And the last and final point concerns continuity. In Hebrews 4, the author describes the words of God as being living and active. The New Testament, in particular the book of Acts, is left as a sort of unfinished, open-ended sort of book. You read the story of Jesus, then you read what his believers do, and then there's a sort of unfinished air to it because it doesn't really end. And there's a reason for that, because the story isn't ended, it isn't over. We are still living the story. We are part of the continued story of God and his mission to help humanity and heal creation. And this should tell us something about how we should view the Bible as well. It is indeed God-inspired, given through divine revelation. And it's not that the Bible is changing, but rather as we study it, we will change and grow. Often when we talk about the Bible, we talk about it in terms of something dead and dormant and stagnant. For example, we say the Bible must be preserved. The Bible must be protected. It must be defended. But perhaps the engaging journey it invites us on, this lifelong journey, should more be phrased as the Bible must be explored, must be experienced and revisited. Because if we have a relationship with a living God, we will move and grow. That can sound scary, but that's also a part of moving to a better place. Paul had to move from viewing believers of Jesus as a Jewish cult that posed the threat of heresy, and discovering that Jesus was the very Messiah he'd been waiting for all his life. Peter had to grow. He had to be taught through elaborate demonstration that Gentiles were just as much the children of God as the Jews. And he still fell back into old habits and thinking and had to be reminded and corrected repeatedly. Consider these two names. If they had to move, what makes us so arrogant as to believe we don't? The very nature of the narrative of the Bible is an ongoing story. This is the invitation of the Bible. Not stagnation, not entrenchment, not blind and anxious defense of tradition. It is a lion that we needn't defend or prop up, but calls us to responsible use, a God-breathed document that will grow with you. And you will keep seeing new things. And on that note, we end our final class and our course together, with that hope that each of you will continue to use the tools that we were talking about here. I sincerely hope that that journey has been an enlightening and a useful one. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Ida for being our co-host this past week. She's been an invaluable support to the team at Citeo School, following the long process of putting this course together. Thank you also to Derek Simon for his support in his project and his research work. And finally, thank you to our patrons who supported us over on Patreon or gave us money donations. Your donations really help us keep doing what we're doing. If you believe in the work that we're doing at Citeo, here's our Patreon. You can give a one-time donation. The details are on the screen, but I'd like to stress either way, our courses will always remain free, and we are determined to reject paywalls. So you are always welcome here. You are also welcome to check out our online house church called The House. You'll find this on YouTube, also in your resources list. We have a bunch of exciting Bible stories on there that you can watch. I'm not good at goodbyes, so I will sign off and slink into the night. Feel free to email us if you have any questions that we didn't answer here. If you have anything you'd like to discuss with us, we'd love to help you. Please do contact us. But thank you for your patience and for joining us, and may God inspire you all. Bye for now.